The parasite is, to put it simply, a ballbuster. Like your ex-wife, the foul odor secreting from its mutated pits will be ringing your doorbell in the middle of the night demanding alimony. But for the Flood, it's 24/7 and only wants the small thing of devouring everything you ever loved in universal domination. So I thought, is there a cure? Has anyone ever come up with a cure for the Flood? And wow, I got some surprising answers for you guys. I think it's going to be a good one. Let's go ahead and get into it. Quick reminder, I am giving away a 4K 55-inch Ultra HD Smart TV. Participate at followergg.com, link below. So is there a cure for the Flood? Or my ED? Well, we're gonna focus on the Flood today and exactly what it is we are curing. So the most basic Flood form is that of a Flood spore, an extremely small molecule like an airborne infection that could actually successfully infect someone just by them breathing it in. If you played Halo, you certainly know that the Flood take upon many forms. Some unique to the Flood, others mainly based off infected alien species or persons themselves. However, the Flood depend mostly on the Flood infection form. Yeah, that's the name for it, just the Flood infection form. The most basic form beyond the spore. What makes the Flood such a powerful, menacing foe and so hard to defeat is that they can feed on your allies and then turn them against you. So when Human and Sankili fight, when one side dies, I mean that's it. They're not going to infect yourself, right? Well, the same thing with the cure is that if a Flood comes and attacks your friends and infect them, well, now they can't be infected, and so they may die by bullets or some explosion that the Flood could cause, but they're not going to come and infect you. And with that being said, the Flood depend entirely off their food source. So if there's no more food, if they just can't consume it, they're going to have a very hard time bringing in reinforcements. The Flood rely on big numbers to overwhelm the enemy, in which when given the opportunity, if not breathed in first, the Flood will then advance and penetrate underneath the skin and tap into the spinal cord, in which, much like hijacking a vehicle, will hijack the nervous system of the creature, which almost instantly kills the host. However, in rare cases, some survive this hijacking. After this, it releases a Flood supercell into your body, in which it will begin to overwrite your DNA basically and causes rapid mutation. If this sounds a lot like having sex with someone that has gonorrhea or another terrible STD, you're not wrong. And to make matters worse, just like your bitch ex-girlfriend, the Flood form will climb into your fucking chest cavity and leave you ultimately, utterly fucked. So, is there a cure for this? Well, today we're not going to focus on the already getting gangbanged by a million Flood forms, but rather we're going to focus on the immunity of the Flood's hijacking and the Flood's DNA injection. Basically, we're going to focus on the condom when fucking with the Flood. So let's start from the beginning, the very beginning. I was about 8 years old, wrong script. More than 10 million years before the beginning of Halo's story, the Foreigners lived amongst the precursors. Also an ancient and incredibly advanced species, so far ahead that they were deemed by the Foreigners as transcendent and godlike, being able to travel between galaxies and just the universe period. However, much like the Foreigners deemed humanity to hold the responsibility of the mantle, the precursors actually intended humanity originally to hold the mantle of responsibility, as twisted irony as that is. The Foreigners, angered by their ideals' decision initially, decided to just fucking kill them. That's right, they were upset, so they just decided to kill their gods. It is with this that the precursors would exact vengeance many years later and release a new form of themselves known as the Flood. Basically, the Foreigners killed their gods and they turned into the Flood, and now they're fucking everyone. So now let's fast forward about 10 million years and catch up to what is about 100,000 years before the beginning of Halo 1 during the wonderful days of Forerunner and human peace, which eventually had turned into the Foreigner-Human War. The parasite would begin harassing the ancient Sanshayon and humanity for a while to build up forces, although it is pretty obvious with the lore that we know that the Flood wanted to screw the Foreigners like they had screwed them many years ago. As the flood was spreading throughout ancient humanity and they were running away from the flood as the Foreigners were also fighting them, they had actually set a specific set of genealogy and implanted that into many of the survivors of the war, and that was actually supposed to solve the parasite infection, that little hijacking we were talking about earlier. And surprisingly, it actually worked. Ancient humanity had cured the flood, in a sense. Although it's not clear whether already infected bodies would be healed, right, the ones that were already gangbanged, I really doubt it since the infection forms tend to corrupt the mind and kind of kill the host instantly, right? You know, tearing the bones apart, kind of making it a walking corpse basically. But I don't think the infected would want to come back to life from the grave anyway, just a wish to be fully dead, right? As the human-Forerunner war waged on though, humanity was eventually cornered and defeated, and almost poetically, and so with the cure that they had of the flood eradicated, or so we think. The Primordial, which was basically the original Gravemind, revealed that not too long after all this, that it was actually the flood's choice to retreat away from humanity right around the time that they had supposedly came up with this immunity, claiming that it wasn't humanity's time to be challenged. And it wasn't unusual at this time, or any time in fact, that the flood make big strategic decisions like this. A lot of people think of the flood as just a bunch of hungry horde monsters, but they're actually being controlled by the Gravemind, right, and a central intelligence. During the Battle of the Magniot Line, which was basically the last defense of the Foreigners against the flood later on, the biggest and deadliest battle in Halo lore with millions of ships fighting against the Foreigners, the flood withdrawal is consuming entirely and mustered all of its forces to attack upon Forerunner defenses, which is a perfect example that the Primordial could have been telling the truth. Although he could have also been lying because the Graveminds, just like the Primordial, are all slithering, psychopath, manipulative pieces of shit. So yeah. So after all this, we really don't know if humanity at that point had come up with a cure or not, but it doesn't really matter because it's gone now. Desperate for solutions, the Foreigners actually went out and got Legolo worms as a way to fight back against the flood. These worms, like most creatures, do in fact have a nervous system, which is essential for the flood to infect. What's so interesting about the Legolo and infection is that each individual flood form would have to latch itself onto a Legolo worm. And well, they don't really supply much biomass, much food for the flood. They're a huge inconvenience. Compare this to a single biological form like a human or a Senkili is much easier to infect, a considerable size of biomass, and can be turned into a weapon, right? They can run around with weapons and attack. I will say that the Legolo are probably the creature in the entire Halo lore that would be the best to survive against the flood. They can bury themselves deep underground, they can survive a Halo blast ring. Basically, as a species, they are invincible. So eventually, as the Forerunner-human war waged on, humanity bit the dust. They lost, they've been wiped out mostly, and they were thrown back into the Stone Age. Not extinct, but just thrown back into the Stone Age. The Foreigners now had to deal with their impending doom of the flood. They knew how dangerous the flood were, and since the flood was so cunning, even their own ships would return fire upon them once infected. Even the infamous Super Incilia AI Mendicant Bias would eventually succumb to the Gravemind by the Logic Plague and push the Foreigners to their own demise. Over 2,000 solar systems had now been festering with the parasites, had been taken over, and that grew to over 500,000 solar systems. As the war spun out of control, and it was pretty obvious at this point that the Foreigners may really lose this battle, the Foreigners grew very desperate, and to counteract, the Foreigners built a digital world in which their consciousness could be extracted upon. The process of this was called composing, which we can actually see a lot of composing in action during Halo 4, when several scientists are transformed into Prometheans on Ivanov's station, which, mind you, those souls now cannot be infected by the flood since they're Prometheans, as with the population of New Phoenix. In theory, since the digital creatures couldn't be eaten, the warriors could not feed on the enemy, the one thing that the flood needs to survive. However, this was seen as cruel and immoral, but the Eurydidect threw this shit away, said fuck you, and composed innocent humans. Composing would cure the flood by literally destroying your organic body, which looks really painful, mind you, and turning you into something without nutrients or flesh, into a mindless drone, I guess. Despite this, the Eurydidect had corrupted his genes through obsessive experimental self-mutation to become immune to the flood himself. He, as with many, tried to find an immunity, all which failed. All which attempts were big failures. Now there's some ugly fucking aliens in Halo, but foreigners, as some believe, aren't this naturally gross looking. The Didact just sent himself to planet fucked. It was also around this time that ancient humanity, the ones that had been defeated, lived a tribal peaceful life on Installation 07, or also known as Zeta Halo, which we're actually, visiting in Halo Infinite. In fact, even the remnants of, quote, the people and their civilization ruins can be seen in said engine demo. Perhaps even the words on the wall maybe is written by them. I'd say certainly it is written by them. Eventually, foreigners begin to kidnap these humans from their peaceful towns and ancient cities. Why? Well, they took them to a place called the Palace of Pain, the people called it. But actually, the Palace of Pain was many different facilities on the ring that was secretly supervised by the Primordial with Mendicant Bias in charge officially. In these places, the horrors that took place would haunt its visitors, some getting sick, dying, or oddly, some returning home completely unharmed. Regardless, this sounds like a shitty place for vacation. Don't go here. During an experiment, it was discovered that a possible immunity had been made, as the flood just would not eat certain humans. But this was actually later realized as a part of the flood's strategy to confuse and manipulate the war with the foreigners. So that concludes the gist of immunization in biological counters to the flood during the more ancient days. But what about nowadays during the 2500s? Well, the first example leads us to Spartan 1 Project, or aka the Orion Project. This was Oni's first attempt at making biochemically augmented super soldiers, Spartans, that would eventually lead to all the super soldiers that we've seen in Halo, like Master Chief. But interestingly enough, including Sergeant Johnson, underwent corrupted nerve reactions to the augmentations and basically the toxic chemicals that they would put into the person's body. Basically, Sergeant Johnson wasn't, immune entirely to the flood, but he just didn't look as delicious as others that hadn't gone under the Orion Project augmentations. For example, if the flood saw all humans as delicious warm chocolate cake, Johnson would be the bagel in the corner on the floor. I want to say that this is a cure outright. Really what it is a band-aid on a big open gash. I mean, it could be duplicated, but considering the process of the Orion subjects, it would have been very dangerous, unstable, and an ineffective effort to give this cure to other soldiers or even civilians so that they would also look like the dirty bagel would just be a really, really shitty idea. Not only would it fuck all future generations and give many people probably cancer and illnesses and mutations, I think that this would do a lot more damage than good. And not to mention that Sergeant Johnson is one of the people that actually survived, right? Because these chemicals, the augmentations, were literally life-threatening to have. So it's not really worth it. And by the way, it isn't impossible to eat a dirty bagel on the floor covered in spider webs. I did it today actually. So yeah, the flood would still eat everyone anyway, but they would prefer chocolate cake. So with the flood returning in Halo Wars 2 DLC, Awakening the Nightmare, and us returning to a Halo ring, Installation 07 in Halo Infinite, many of us have the rightful belief that the flood will be making a big comeback. In fact, the human experiments we talked about earlier took place on this ring. Remember the Palace of Pain reference? Well, yeah, that happened here. The ring also possesses many controlled containments with up to 10 proto-grave mines and other flood specimen, and even back in 2558, the Swords of Synkelio successfully contained a quarantine of escaped flood on this very ring. So yeah, it looks like the flood really want to come up and devour everything on this ring, all that beautiful wildlife, right? So I believe one thing will lead to another and Zetahalo will become infested, if not at least stuck at the lower parts of the ring, in which Master Chief will, for some reason, have to deal with, similar to like in Halo 1. If we look back in Halo 4, Master Chief was given, quote, many gifts by the Librarian, one of them being invulnerability to becoming composed, like the Eurodidact. So I wonder, one of these gifts may be immunity, or some kind of countermeasure to fend off the parasite. And if that's the case, bitch, why aren't you giving that to everybody? I don't know, fuck me. But with all that being said, we have to consider that the Flood were once the precursors, right? They were very different. And even if a cure was finally created, how long would it be until the Flood would just adjust and mutate to something else, making the cure, making the immunity, making the condom completely irrelevant? Could you imagine? Flood takes over everything, and the only people that they can't kill are people on Viagra. So will there ever be a cure to the Flood? Is it even possible? Well, with all the evidence we have in Halo lore, as presented in this video, I'm sure I missed a lot, honestly. There's just a lot of lore to go through. It's not for certain that any strategy is the best, or even really works. And maybe besides killing yourself and vanishing into the digital world, the domain, right? Even if a cure was discovered, the Flood could just feed on other life and kill the immune with brute force or weapons. Certainly a cure would help, but would not be the end to the Flood's rampage, and certainly they would still have to be dealt with. So guys, that's all I have for today's video. If I missed anything, be sure to let me know down in the comments below. Do you think there is a cure for the Flood? Did I miss anything with a cure in Halo lore? What do you think about all this? Would you try to find a cure if the Flood was in your reality in the future in 2500s? Let me know down in the comments below. Guys, thank you so much for watching this video. It's been a blast. By the way, remember, go check out our giveaway. I am giving away a big-ass TV, 55-inch 4K TV. Just go to followergg.com, link down below. Guys, subscribe if you enjoyed, and I will see you in the next one. Peace.